Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today, I can't wait to do an episode for Napoleon Hill. I've covered so many incredible authors: Orson Swett Marden, Neville Goddard, Vadim Zeland. The list just goes on, and I've tried to expand. We got Joseph Benner recently, Anthony Norvell, Jane Roberts, Alan Watts. The number of different New Thought authors that we've explored has been fantastic, but we haven't covered Napoleon Hill yet, and Napoleon Hill may be the greatest of them all. He's definitely on the Mount Rushmore of these New Thought authors. He changed my life. He has a certain writing style. He's amazing. People always treat Napoleon Hill like the guy that wrote Think and Grow Rich, but he wrote so much more. His story is fascinating, so we're going to talk about that in a second. But what we're going to do today is we're going to go over one of his most famous speeches and the story behind it. It's very fascinating. If you don't know Napoleon Hill, then you should. Think and Grow Rich is an absolutely must-read book for everybody. And I may end up reading it on the program if you guys want me to. But Napoleon Hill, he was also a philosopher and he was a teacher. He probably taught more people how to achieve financial and spiritual success than any other person. He had a super exciting life, and he developed the science of success, which was a study laid down the principles by which you can realize material goals, no matter what ambitions they may be. He was the confidant of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford. At least that's what he claimed. In fact, it was Carnegie who started him on the research that resulted in his 17 principles of success. We'll talk about that particular part of the story in a second. Millions of persons credit Hill with inspiring them to greater heights of fortune in life than they have ever believed possible, and so do I. I definitely attribute my success to Napoleon Hill. What the human mind can conceive and believe the human mind can achieve was the core of his philosophy. And you can, he would say, be anything that you want to be if you only believe with sufficient conviction and act in accordance with your faith. Hundreds of millions of people have read Think and Grow Rich since it was published in 1937. But the story behind Napoleon Hill is very fascinating. When you go and look behind the scenes at his beginnings, that is why I love him so much, because he was a struggler and he didn't have this wonderful beginning. If you read the story, and definitely check out my interview with Mitch Horowitz, who has some great books on Napoleon Hill. And in that episode, we kind of discuss the dark side of Napoleon Hill in his early history. If you watch London Rose, and in one of the interviews I was watching the other day, they were criticizing Napoleon Hill. And so the story goes that he may not have met Andrew Carnegie, that the biographer for Andrew Carnegie cannot find any evidence that they met. We know he probably met a lot of other people, but at that beginning point he may not have. And he owned a lumber company at one point and was selling the lumber without actually giving it, and then using the money on credit, kind of like a weird pyramid scheme. And he, according to one article, lost the money, but he has an explanation in this story of what happened. And he was on the run. He was a highwayman. He struggled and he lost a lot of money along the way. And I think because of that, as we learn about our own reality, the only way you can really know what you have is the contrast of it. When you get that contrast, that is where it's most interesting. So in 1922, before he'd ever written a book, Napoleon Hill was invited to give a commencement address. The school was in Salem, West Virginia, I think. And he was 39 years old. He had never really given any major speeches. He had some experience in writing, and he had been writing for a magazine, I believed. That's kind of what his thing was. He did magazines. The thing that's really great about Napoleon Hill is his later success as he overcame and kind of saw the laws of the universe and then learned to manipulate them and then changed his own life. We all have pasts where we've had businesses that we weren't happy with that we did because we're trying to make money. I've met so many people, and then they feel guilty about some terrible business that they were in the past. And the idea is there is a way. Anything is possible to find a business that is good, that is benefiting you, that is wholesome and proper. And he talks about that in his books. You see the transformation in his books, The Laws of Success and Think and Grow Rich, where you see the importance of doing correct and right work for people and the golden rule. And so this speech really captures the golden rule that he learned in this process. And he answers these people's argument that I see on the internet about Napoleon Hill being a highwayman or whatever. He wasn't. It's part of his story. It's just like the alcoholic that overcomes alcoholism. He had to be an alcoholic at some point, right? He influenced so many people. And so I want to read this commencement speech that he gave because it talks about the golden rule and how to create reality and the things that you face in life and chasing that pot at the end of the rainbow. And I think you're going to love it. The End of the Rainbow. 1922 Commencement Address at Salem College by Napoleon Hill. There is a legend as old as the human race that tells us that a pot of gold can be found at the end of a rainbow. This is a fairy tale which grips the imaginative child's mind. May have something to do with the present tendency of the human race to look for the easy way to find riches. For nearly 20 years, I sought the end of my rainbow that I might claim that pot of gold. My struggle in search of the evasive rainbow's end was ceaseless. It carried me up the mountainside of failure and down the hillsides of despair, luring me on and on in search of the phantom pot of gold. I was sitting before a fire one night, discussing with older people the question of unrest upon the part of laboring men. The labor union movement had just begun to make itself in that part of the country where then I lived. And the tactics used by the labor organizers impressed me as being too revolutionary and obstructive ever to bring permanent success. One of the men who sat before that fireside with me made a comment that proved to be one of the best pieces of advice that I have ever followed. He reached over and firmly grasped me by the shoulders, looked me squarely in the eyes and said, "Why, you are a bright boy, and if you will give yourself an education, you will make your mark in this world." The first concrete result of that remark caused me to enroll in a local business college, a step which I am duty-bound to admit proved to be one of the most helpful that I ever took. because I got my first fleeting glimpse in business college of what one might call a fair sense of proportions. After completing business college, I obtained a position as a stenographer and bookkeeper and worked in this capacity for several years. As a result of this idea of performing more service and better service than paid for, which I had learned in business college, I advanced rapidly and always succeeded in filling positions of responsibility far in advance of my years, with salary proportionate. I saved money and soon had a bank account amounting to several $1,000s. I was rapidly advancing toward my rainbow's end. My reputation spread rapidly, and I found competitive bidders for my services. I was in demand, not because of what I knew, which was little enough, but because of my willingness to make the best use of what little I did know. This spirit of willingness proves to be the most powerful and strategic principle I have ever learned. The tides of fate blew me southward, and I became a sales manager for a large lumber manufacturing concern. I knew nothing about lumber, and I knew nothing about sales management, but I had learned that it was well to render better service and more of it than I was paid for. And with this principle as the dominant spirit, I tackled my job with the determination to find out all I could about selling lumber. I made a good record. My salary was increased twice during the year, and my bank account was growing bigger and bigger. I did so well in managing the sales of my employer's lumber that he organized a new lumber company that took me into partnership with him. I could see myself growing nearer and nearer to the rainbow's end. Money and success poured into me from every direction, all of which fixed my attention steadfastly on the pot of gold that I could plainly see just ahead of me. Up to this time, it did not occur to me that success could consist of anything except gold. The unseen hand. The unseen hand allowed me to strut around under the influence of my vanity until I had begun to feel my importance. In the light of more sober years and a more accurate interpretation of human events, I now wonder if the unseen hand does not purposely permit us foolish human beings to parade before our own mirror of vanity until we see how vulgar we are and stop it. At any rate, I seem to have a clear track ahead. There was coal in the bunker, water in the tank. My hand was on the throttle and I opened it wide. Fate was awaiting me just around the bend with a stuffed club. And it wasn't stuffed with cotton. And I didn't see the impending crash until it came. Like a stroke of lightning out of the clear blue sky. An economic collapse and panic crashed down on me. Overnight, it swept away every dollar that I had. The man with whom I was in business with withdrew, panic-stricken, but without loss, and left me with nothing but the empty shell of a company that owned nothing except a good reputation. I could have bought $100,000 of lumber on that reputation. A crooked lawyer saw a chance to cash in on that reputation and what was left of the lumber company on my hands. He and a group of other men purchased the company and continued to operate it. I learned later that they bought every dollar worth of lumber that they could get, resold it, and pocketed the proceeds without paying for it. Thus, I had been the innocent means of helping them defraud their creditors, who learned when it was too late that I was in no way connected with the company. It required an economic collapse and the next failure that it brought to me to divert and redirect my efforts from the lumber business to the study of law. Nothing on earth but failure, or what I then called failure, could have brought about that result. Thus, a turning point of my life was ushered in on the wings of failure. There is a great lesson in every failure, whether we know what it is or not. When I entered law school, it was with the firm belief that I would emerge doubly prepared to catch up with the end of the rainbow and claim my pot of gold. I still had no higher aspiration than that of accumulating money. Yet, the very thing that I worshipped most seemed to be the most elusive thing on earth. For it was always evading me, always in sight, but always just out of reach. I attended law school at night and worked as an automobile salesman during the day. My sales experience in the lumber business was turned to good advantage. I prospered rapidly, doing so well from the habit of performing more and better service than paid for, that the opportunity came to open a school to train ordinary machinists in automotive assembly and repair work. This school prospered until it was paying me a large monthly salary. Again, I had my rainbow's end in sight. Again, I knew that it had at last found my niche in the world's work. Again, I knew that nothing could swerve me from my course or cause me to divert my attention. My banker saw me prospering. He extended me credit for expansion. He encouraged me to invest in outside lines of business. He appeared to me to be one of the finest men in the world. He loaned me thousands of dollars on my signature without endorsement. My banker loaned me money until I was hopelessly in his debt. And then he took over my business. It all happened so suddenly that it had dazed me. I didn't think such a thing possible. You see, I still had much to learn about the ways of men, especially the kind of man that unfortunately my banker turned out to be, a type which, in justice to the business of banking, I ought to say is rare. This failure was one of the greatest blessings that ever was bestowed upon me. From a man of affairs earning a good income, owner of a half-dozen automobiles and much other junk which I didn't need, I was reduced to poverty. The rainbow's end disappeared. And it was many years before I learned that this failure was one of the greatest blessings that ever was bestowed upon me, because it forced me out of a business which in no way helped me develop the human side and diverted my efforts into a channel that brought me an experience that I greatly needed. I think it is worthy of note to state here that I went back to Washington, D.C. a few years after the event, and out of curiosity visited the old bank where I once had a liberal line of credit, expecting, of course, to find it still in operation. To my great surprise, I found that the bank had gone out of business, and my erstwhile banker had been reduced to penury and want. I met him on the street, practically penniless, with eyes red and swollen. He aroused in me a questioning attitude, and I wondered for the first time in my life if one might find any other thing of value except money at the rainbow's end. Because I was my wife's husband and her people had influence, I secured an appointment as assistant to the chief counsel for a family-owned business. My salary was greatly out of proportion to the wages that the company usually paid beginners, and still further out of proportion to what I was worth. But pull is pull, and I was there because I was there. It turned out what I lacked in legal ability, I supplied through that one sound, fundamental principle that I had learned in business college, namely, to render more service and better service than paid for, whenever possible. I was holding my position without any difficulty. I practically had a berth for life if I cared to keep it. One day, I did what my closest personal friends and relatives said was a very foolish thing. I quit my job abruptly. When pressed for a reason, I gave what seemed to me to be a very sound one. But I had trouble convincing the family circle that I had acted wisely, and still greater difficulty convincing a few of my friends that I was perfectly rational in mind. I quit that job because I found the work too easy and demanding too little effort, and I found myself drifting. This move proved to be an important turning point in my life, although it was followed by 10 years of effort that brought almost every grief that the human heart could experience. I quit my job in the legal field where I was getting along well, living among friends and relatives with what they believed to be a bright and unusually promising future. And I moved to Chicago. I selected Chicago because I believed it to be the most competitive place in the world. I felt that if I could go to Chicago and gain recognition along any legitimate line, I would prove to myself that I had the material in me that might someday develop into real ability. In Chicago, I secured the position of advertising manager. I knew next to nothing about advertising, but my experience previous as a salesman came to my rescue, and my old friend, the habit of performing more services than paid for, gave me a fair balance on the credit side of the ledger. The first year I flourished. I was coming back to leaps and bounds. Gradually the rainbow began to circle around me, and I saw once more that shining pot of gold almost within reach. I believed it of importance to recall the fact that my standard of success was always measured in terms of dollars, and my rainbow's end promised nothing but a pot of gold up to this point. If the thought that anything except gold might be found at the end of the rainbow, that thought was momentary and quickly vanished. History is full of evidence that a feast usually precedes a fall. I was having my feast, but never thought of the fall. I suspect that no one ever anticipates the fall until it comes, but come it will unless one's fundamental guiding principles are sound. I made a good record as an advertising manager. The president of the company was attracted by my work and later helped organize the Betsy Ross Candy Company, and I became its president, thus beginning the next most important turning point of my life and the prelude to another failure. The business began to expand until we had a chain of stores in many different cities. Again, I saw my rainbow's end, almost within reach. I knew that I had at last found the business in which I wanted to remain for life, and I frankly admit that our business was fashioned after that of another candy company whose Western manager was my personal friend. His overwhelming success was the main factor in causing me to enter the candy business. Everything went smoothly for a time, until my business associate and a third man, whom we later took into the business, conceived the notion to gain control of my interests without paying for it, a mistake that men never seem to understand that they are making until it is too late and they have paid the price of their folly. The plan worked, but I balked more stiffly than they had anticipated. Therefore, to gently urge me along toward the grand exit, they had me arrested on a false charge and offered to settle out of court if I would turn over my interest in the company. I refused and insisted on going to trial. When the time arrived for court, no one was present to prosecute. We insisted on prosecution and requested the court to summon the complaining witnesses and make him prosecute, which was done. The judge, the Honorable Arnold Heap, stopped the proceeding and threw the case out of court before it had gone very far, with the statement that this is one of the most flagrant cases of attempted coercion that has ever come before me. To protect my reputation, I brought suit for $50,000 in damages. The case was tried 5 years later, and I secured a heavy judgment in the Superior Court of Chicago. The suit was a tort action, meaning that it claimed damages for the libelous injury to my reputation. But I suspect that another and much more exacting law than that, under which tort actions may be brought, was operating during those 5 years, because one of the parties, the one who originated the scheme to have me arrested as part of the plan to force my interests in the business away from me, was serving a term in the federal penitentiary before my action against him was tried, and for a crime separate and apart from the one he had committed against me. The other party had fallen from a high station in life to poverty and disgrace. My judgment stands in the records of the Superior Court of Chicago as silent evidence of the vindication of my character, and as evidence of something far more important than mere vindication, namely that the unseen hand which guides the destiny of all who earnestly seek truth had eliminated from my nature all desire for my pounds of flesh. My judgment against my transducers was not collected, and it never will be. At least I will never collect it, because I suspect that it has been paid many times over in blood and remorse and regret and failure visited upon those who would have destroyed my character for personal gain. This was one of the greatest single blessings that ever came to me, because it taught me to forgive. It taught me also that the law of compensation is always in operation, and that whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. It blotted out of my nature the last lingering thought of seeking personal revenge at any time under any circumstances. It taught me that time is the friend of all who are right and the mortal enemy of all who are unjust and destructive in their efforts. It brought me nearer to a full understanding of the Master when he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." We can now come to another venture that probably brought me nearer to the rainbow's end than any of the others, because it placed me in a position where I found it necessary to bring all the knowledge that I had acquired up to that time concerning every subject with that which I was familiar, and gave me opportunity for self-expression and personal development, such as rarely comes to a man so early in life. I turned my efforts toward teaching advertising and salesmanship. Some wise philosopher has said that we never learn much until we start trying to teach others. My experience as a teacher proved that this is true. My school prospered from the start. I had a resident school and a correspondence school, through which I was teaching students in nearly every English-speaking country. In spite of the ravages of war, my school was growing by leaps and bounds, and I saw the end of my rainbow drawing near and near. I was so close that I could almost reach out and touch the pot of gold. As a result of the record that I was making and the recognition I was gaining, I attracted the attention of the head of a corporation who employed me for 3 weeks out of each month at a salary of $105,200 a year, considerably more than the President of the United States had received. In less than 6 months, I built up one of the most efficient working forces in America and increased the assets of the company to a point where it was offered $20 million more for its business than it was worth when I started. Candidly, had you been in my place, would you not have felt justified in saying that you found your rainbow's end? Would you have felt justified in saying that you had attained success? I thought I had. But I had one of the rudest shocks of all awaiting me, due partly to the dishonesty of the head of the corporation for whom I was working, but more directly, I suspect, to a deeper and more significant cause concerning which fate seemed to have decreed that I should learn something. $100,000 of my salary was conditional upon my remaining as the directing head of staff for a period of 1 year. In less than half that time, I began to see that I was pyramiding power and placing it in the hands of a man who was growing power drunk. I began to see that ruin awaited him just around the corner. This discovery brought me much grief. Morally, I was responsible for several $1 million of capital that I had induced the American people to invest in this corporation. Legally, of course, I was in no way responsible. I finally brought this matter to a head, delivering an ultimatum to the head of the corporation to safeguard the funds of the company under a board of financial control, or else accept my resignation. He laughed at the suggestion because he thought I would not break my contract and thereby lose $100,000. Perhaps I would not have done so had it not been for the moral responsibility that I felt on behalf of the thousands of investors. I resigned and the company passed into the hands of receivership, and therefore I did all I could to protect it against the mismanagement of a money-mad young man, a bit of satisfaction that brought me much ridicule and cost me $100,000. For the moment, my rainbow's end seemed vague and somewhat distant. There were moments when I wondered what caused me to make a fool of myself and throw away a fortune just to protect those who never would even know that I had made sacrifices for them. In my climax, I will tabulate the sum total of all that I have learned from each of the important failures and mileposts of my life. But first, let me describe the last of those failures. To do so, I must go back to that eventful day, November 11th, 1918. That was Armistice Day. As everyone knows, like most other people, I became as drunk with enthusiasm and joy as any man ever did on wine. I was practically penniless, as the war had destroyed my business, and I had turned my efforts to war work. But I was happy to know that the slaughter was over, and reason was about to spread its beneficial wings over the earth once more. The war had swept away my school, from which my income would have amounted to over $15,000 a year, had our students not been drafted for war, and had I not felt my own duty to turn my efforts to help my country in its time of need. I stood as far away from my rainbow's end as I did on that eventual day more than 20 years previously, when I looked into the drift mouth of a coal mine when I was employed as a laborer, and thought of that statement that a kindly old gentleman had made me the night before, but realized that a yawning chasm stood between me and any accomplishment other than a laborer in the mines. But I was happy again. Again, that tramp thought entered my consciousness and prompted me to ask myself if I had not been searching for the wrong sort of reward at my rainbow's end. I sat down to my typewriter with nothing particular in mind. To my astonishment, my hands began to play a regular symphony upon the keys of the typewriter. I had never written so rapidly or easily before. I did not think of what I was writing. I just wrote and kept on writing. When I was through, I had 5 pages of manuscript, and as near as I have been able to determine, that manuscript was written without any organized thoughts on my part. It was an editorial out of which my first magazine, Napoleon Hill's Golden Rule magazine, was born. I took this editorial to a wealthy man and read it to him. Before I had read the last line, he had promised to finance the magazine. It was in this somewhat dramatic manner that a desire that had lain dormant in my mind for nearly 20 years began to express itself. It was the same idea that I had in mind when I made the statement that caused that old gentleman to lay his hand on my shoulder and make that fortunate remark 20 years previously, which had its foundation the thought that the golden rule ought to be the guiding spirit in all human relationships. All my life, I'd wanted to become a newspaper editor. More than 20 years ago, when I was a very small boy, I used to kick the press for my father, who published a small newspaper, and I grew to love the smell of the printer's ink. The important thing to which I would direct your attention is the fact that I found my proper niche in the world's work, that I was very happy in it. Strangely enough, I entered upon this work, which constituted my last lap in this long trail over which I had traveled in search of my rainbow's end, with never thought of finding a pot of gold. The magazine prospered from the beginning. In less than 6 months, it was being read in every English-speaking country in the world. It has brought me recognition from all parts of the world, which resulted in a public speaking tour in 1920, covering every large city in America. Up to now, I had made about as many enemies as I had friends. Now, a strange thing has happened, beginning with my initial editorial work. I commenced to make friends by the thousands. Until today, upwards of 100,000 people stand squarely back of me because they believe in me and my message. What brought about this change? If you understand the law of attraction, you can answer this, because you know that like attracts like, and that a man will attract friends or foes according to the nature of the thoughts that dominate his mind. One cannot take a belligerent attitude toward life and expect to make friends. When I commenced to preach the golden rule in my first magazine, I started to live it as near as I could. There is a big difference between merely believing in the golden rule and actually practicing it in overt acts of a truth I learned when I began my first magazine. This realization brought me abruptly into an understanding of a principle that now permeates every thought, that finds a permanent lodging place in my mind and dominates every act I perform as nearly as humanly possible. And that thought is none other than the one laid down by the Master in his Sermon on the Mount, when he admonished us to do unto others as we would have others to do unto us. During these past 3 years, since I have been sending out golden rule thought vibrations to hundreds of thousands of people, these thought waves have multiplied themselves in the rebound and have brought back to me floods of goodwill from those whom my message reached. I was rapidly approaching my rainbow's end for the 7th and last time. Every avenue of failure seemed close. My enemies had been slowly transformed into friends, and I was making new friends by the thousands. But there was a final test to undergo. As I have stated, I was approaching the end of my rainbow with the firm belief that nothing on earth could stop me from attaining it and obtaining my pot of gold and everything else that a successful searcher for the great reward might expect. Like a stroke of lightning out of the clear sky, I received a shock. The impossible had happened. My first magazine, Napoleon Hill's Golden Rule magazine, was not only snatched out of my hand overnight, but its influence that I had built up was temporarily turned as a weapon against me. Again, man had failed me, and I thought unkind thoughts about man. It was a savage blow to me when I awoke to the realization that there was no truth to the Golden Rule that I had been preaching to thousands of people through the pages of my magazine and in person, and had been doing my level best to live as well. This was the supreme moment of testing. Had my experience proved my most beloved principle to be false, and nothing more than a snare with which to trip the untutored? Or was I about to learn a great lesson which would establish the truth and soundness of those principles for the remainder of my life, and perhaps throughout eternity? These were the questions that pressed upon me. I did not answer them quickly. I could not. I was so stunned that I had to stop and catch my breath. I had been preaching that one could not steal another man's ideas or plans or goods and wares and still prosper. My experience seemed to give the lie to all I had ever written or spoken along this line, because the men who stole the child of my heart and brain seemed not only to be prospering with it, but they had actually used it as a means of stopping me from carrying out my plans for worldwide service in the interest of the human race. Months passed by and I was unable to turn a wheel. I had been deposed, my magazine had been taken away from me, and my friends seemed to look upon me as a sort of fallen Richard the Lionheart. Some said I would come back stronger and bigger for the experience. Others said I was through. Thus the remarks came and went, but I stood looking on in wonderment, feeling much the same as a person feels who is undergoing a nightmare, and so cannot awaken or move as much as a finger. Literally, I was experiencing a wide-awake nightmare that seemed to hold me firmly within its grasp. My courage was gone. My faith in humanity was all but gone. My love for humanity was weakening. Slowly but surely, I was reversing my opinion concerning the highest and best ideals that I had been building for more than a score of years. The passing weeks seemed like an eternity. The days seemed like a whole lifetime. One day, the atmosphere began to clear. Some cloudy atmospheres usually do clear away. Time is a wonderful healer of wounds. Time cures nearly everything that is sick or ignorant, and most of us are both at times. During the seventh and greatest failure of my life, I was reduced to greater poverty than any I had ever known before. From a well-furnished home, I was reduced practically overnight to a one-room apartment. Coming as this blow did, just as I was about to lay hold of the pot of gold at my rainbow's end. It cut a deep and ugly wound in my heart. During this brief testing spell, I was made to kneel in the very dust of poverty and eat the crust of my past follies. When I had all but given up, the clouds of darkness began to float away as rapidly as they had come. I stood face to face with one of the most trying tests that ever came to me. Perhaps no human being ever was more severely tried than I was. At least that was the way I felt about it at the time. The postman had delivered my scant collection of mail. As I opened it, I was watching the pale red sun as it had all but disappeared over the western horizon. To me, it was symbolic of that which was about to happen to me, for I saw my sun of hope also setting in the west. I opened the envelope on top, and as I did so, a certificate of deposit fluttered to the floor and fell face upward. It was for $25,000. For a whole minute, I stood with my eyes glued to that bit of paper, wondering if I were not dreaming. I walked over closer to it, picked it up, and read the letter accompanying it. That money was mine. I could draw it out of the bank at will. Only 2 slight strings were attached to it, but these strings made it necessary to obligate myself morally to turn my back on everything that I had been preaching about, placing the interest of the people above those of any individual. The supreme moment of testing had come. Would I accept that money, which was ample capital with which to publish my magazine, or would I return it and carry on a little longer? These were the first questions that claimed my attention. Then I heard the ringing of a bell in the region of my heart. This time, its sound was more direct. It caused the blood to tingle through my body. With the ringing of the bell came the most direct command that ever registered itself in my consciousness. And that command was accompanied by a chemical change in my brain, such as I had never experienced before. It was a positive, startling command, and it brought a message that I could not misunderstand. Without promise of a reward, it made me return that $25,000. I hesitated. That bell kept on ringing. My feet seemed glued to the spot. I could not move out of my tracks. Then I reached my decision. I decided to heed that prompting which no one but a fool could have mistaken. The instant I reached this conclusion, I looked, and in the approaching twilight I saw the rainbow's end. I had at last caught up with it. I saw no pot of gold except the one I was about to send back to the source from which it came. But I found something more precious than all the gold in the world, as I heard a voice that reached me, not through my ears, but through my heart. And it said, "Standeth God within the shadow of every failure." The end of my rainbow brought me the triumph of principle over gold. It gave me a closer communion with the great unseen force of this universe, and new determination to plant the seed of the golden rule philosophically in the hearts of millions of other weary travelers who are seeking the end of their rainbow. In July 1921 issue of Napoleon Hill's magazine, my secretary tells one of the most dramatic events that followed closely upon my decision not to accept financial help from sources that would in any extent whatsoever control my pen. That incident is only one, each constituting sufficient evidence to convince all but fools that the golden rule really works, that the law of compensation is in operation, that whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Not alone did I get all the capital necessary to carry Napoleon Hill's magazine over the beginning period, during which its own revenues were insufficient to publish it. But what is of greater significance, the magazine is growing with rapidly heretofore unknown in the field of similar periodicals. The readers and the public generally have caught the spirit of the work we are doing, and they have put the law of increasing returns into operation in our favor. Now let me summarize the most important lessons I learned in my search for the rainbow's end. I will not try to mention all the lessons, but only the most important ones. I will leave to your own imagination much that you can see without my recounting it here. First and foremost, important of all, in my search for the rainbow's end, I found God in every concrete, understandable, and satisfying manifestation, which is quite significant if I found nothing more. All my life I had been somewhat unsettled as to the exact nature of that unseen hand which directs the affairs of the universe. But my 7 turning points on the rainbow trail of life brought me at last to a conclusion that satisfies. Whether my conclusion is right or wrong is not much importance. The main thing is that it satisfies me. The lessons of importance that I learned are these. I learned that those whom we consider our enemies are in reality our friends. In the light of all that has happened, I would not begin to go back and undo a single one of these trying experiences with which I met, because each one of them brought to me positive evidence of the soundness of the golden rule and the existence of the law of compensation, through which we claim our rewards of virtue and pay the penalties for our ignorance. I learned that time is a friend of all who base their thoughts and actions on truth and justice, and that it is the mortal enemy of all who fail to do so, even though the penalty of the reward is often slow in arriving where it is due. I learned that the only pot of gold worth striving for is that which comes from the satisfaction of knowing that one's efforts are bringing happiness to others, one by one. I have seen those who are unjust with me cut down by failure. I have lived to see every one of them reduced to failure, far beyond anything that they planned against me. The banker I mentioned was reduced to poverty. The men who stole my interest in the Betsy Ross Candy Company and tried to destroy my reputation have come down to what looks like permanent failure, one of them living as a convict in a federal prison. The man who defrauded me out of my $100,000 salary and whom I elevated to wealth and influence has been reduced to poverty and want. At every turn of the road that led finally to my rainbow's end, I was undisputable evidence to back the golden rule philosophy that I am now sending forth through organized effort to hundreds of thousands of people. Lastly, I have learned to listen for the ringing of the bell that guides me when I come to the crossroads of doubt and hesitancy. I've learned to tap a heretofore unknown source from which I get my promptings when I wish to know which way to turn and what to do. And these promptings have never led me in the wrong direction. As I finish, I see on the walls of my study the portraits of great men whose lives I have tried to emulate. Among them is that immortal Lincoln, from whose rugged, careworn face I seem to see a smile emerging, and from whose lips I can all but hear the magic words, "With charity to all and malice toward none." And deep down in my heart, I hear that mysterious bell ringing and bellowing. It comes once more as I close these lines with the greatest message that ever reached my consciousness. Standeth God within the shadow of every failure. So this is the wonderful commencement address that made Napoleon Hill famous. And this address was given before he had ever finished his first book. What an incredible journey that Napoleon Hill had been on. When I hear people saying things that are negative about Napoleon Hill, I will point them to this speech, for he completely explains everything that he went through. And so that episode on London Rose criticizing Napoleon Hill is wrong. But more importantly, let's talk about this, because this jives so much with what I've been talking about on the podcast. Please look at my episodes on how every crisis is an opportunity for breakthrough with the advantage method. In that one, I outline several scenarios and explanations why crises and problems that come up turn out to be benefits. If you want to go back through a great man's life, you will go back through their failures. And as we see here, Napoleon Hill outlines 7 failures, and as he lined them all up, and some of these are absolutely horrifying. Could you imagine having a magazine in your name taken away from you, or a job where you made $20 million for a company just taken away from you? Being ripped off every time, and at the end of it all, being able to forgive. There's something that he continually emphasized, that was the habit of performing more services than paid for. He emphasizes that. And he's emphasizing, of course, the law of compensation, that whatever you sow, you will reap. And in my life, it's the truth. Every failure that I've had made me. I explain those stories in that episode. But whenever I see other people that have ripped me off or done me wrong in the past, something always happened to them. Go back and look at the people that have wronged you. Forgive them. But watch what happens when they're in that vibration. They will attract more and more, and it always works against them. If you have been ripped off right now, or if you've had something happen to you, just know that whatever will happen to them, they will reap for what they have done. And forgive them. Because the big turning point at the end of the rainbow for Napoleon Hill is that he loves everyone. He's found this place in his heart to forgive them and treat others as you would want to be treated. And he emphasizes that. You also see an example given when he talks about with the lumber company, how he had increased his level of importance, which is related to transurfing. And you can see a negative effect of transurfing. Also, the ringing bell of his heart is the same thing as the rustle of the morning stars. And you notice when he starts listening to his heart, and he has something, obviously his mind is telling you got to take the 25,000. But when he starts listening to his heart, that's when he finds the end of the rainbow. So all the way back 100 years ago in this commencement address, from one of the greatest speakers, we see an example of the power of uniting the heart and mind, of reducing your importance, and understanding those laws of cause and effect. You will get what you sow. You will reap what you sow. It's very interesting that he wants to teach a class that's graduating by looking at failure. And then what I say is look at your failures and see how they have transformed you. And you can almost tell he's been through so many crazy failures. He's been ripped off and all these things have happened. that when the last one comes, he's ready for it. And he talks about it like it's a test. You are in the supreme moments of tests. Become aware of what's happening and access your heart when you're in these situations and follow your heart. He talks about having to make these decisions, and all these possibilities are always there for you in the space of variations when you make these decisions. Check out my episode on how to make a decision where I talk about this stuff. You need to listen to your heart when you make these decisions. And that is the perfect way for me to introduce the reality revolution to the Napoleon Hill. Now, it's probably very likely you've already read Napoleon Hill and know all about Napoleon Hill if you're accessing my podcast. But if you haven't, then buckle up, because Napoleon Hill will change your life. There is a unique teaching that you will find in Napoleon Hill as opposed to Neville Goddard or any of these other New Thought authors. And he has a way of teaching a certain diligent energy and propulsive motivation towards action. There's two other things that we will talk about on future episodes, and that is the Mastermind Principle, which I have a meditation on. I've already created called the Quantum Mastermind. Check that out. But the Mastermind's a big part of Napoleon Hill, and it's changed my life, and you can create your own internal mastermind as well. And the other is focusing sexual energy, which he talks about in Think and Grow Rich. Some of the ideas in Think and Grow Rich are more radical than you think. And I think we still have a lot to learn from Napoleon Hill. We will be exploring his teachings further, because they help us to outline our ways to create that perfect reality that I want so desperately for you to have, and that you will have as you unlock and unveil your true inner godhood. In any case, all episodes of The Reality Revolution can be found at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution. The one book you need for these times. Available in all bookstores and on Audible.